The air was thick with tension as Custer's command echoed through the ranks. Charge, seize the Dakota horses, and strike quickly. Red Bear and the other scouts raced down the dry stream bed, their hearts racing with anticipation. The mission was clear, but as they neared the solitary teepee in the distance, the situation began to unravel. The scouts hesitated, tempted by the warmth and food of the lodge. But Custer's fury soon followed, his reprimands sharp and cutting. Little did they know this small delay would ignite a firestorm of violence and chaos, consuming them all. The charge had been given: seize the Dakota horses from their encampment. The scouts hurried down Medicine Tail Coulee, and when Red Bear reached the teepee, the others were already circling it, striking the lodge with their whips. Red Bear joined them, but they paused for about half an hour. "There's plenty of food here," one of the scouts exclaimed. One Feather entered the teepee, drinking the soup left for a deceased Dakota warrior and eating some of the meat. One of the scouts retorted, "Tell him that if he does the same to all his white soldiers who are less brave than we are, it will take him quite some time." The scouts laughed at this and signaled that they were eager for the fight. They resumed riding ahead, but Red Bear observed that Custer veered off to the right with his men, about 50 yards beyond the lone teepee. Gerard continued onward with the scouts. Among them were Young Hawk, Goose, Black Fox, Red Star, Strikes Two, Bloody Knife, Little Sioux, Bobtailed Bull, Forked Horn, Red Foolish Bear, Boy Chief, Little Brave, and One Feather. The group charged toward the Little Bighorn River, crossing it and nearing the Dakota camp. Once across, they divided again. 6 scouts turned sharply to the right, heading toward where the Dakota horses were near the timber. Boy Chief and Red Star led, followed by Strikes Two, Black Fox, Little Sioux, and One Feather. The other group, led by Bloody Knife, proceeded toward the Dakota camp. Bloody Knife, far ahead, returned with 3 horses and called out, "Someone take these horses back to the hill. One is for me." Red Bear couldn't see Bloody Knife due to the dust, but later learned it was him. This group included Bloody Knife, Young Hawk, Goose, Forked Horn, Little Brave, Red Bear, Bobtailed Bull, and the 2 Crow Scouts. As they reached the edge of the Sioux camp, gunfire erupted. The scouts dismounted and began shooting. The Dakotas, lying concealed in the bluffs or hills, fired at them from cover. At this time, no one remained on horseback. The scouts, less than a quarter-mile away, dismounted to fire. Forked Horn, stationed at the timber's edge, called out, "Come over to this side." At the ford where they crossed toward the Dakota village, the soldiers caught up with the scouts. The scouts crossed more toward the left, and Red Bear noticed soldiers stringing across the river to his right. The scene was chaotic, with neither soldiers nor officers recognizable in the fray. When Bloody Knife called out about the horses, the soldiers had not yet dismounted, but were present with the scouts. As Forked Horn called out, Red Bear mounted his horse and rode toward him. At the same time, he observed a Dakota horse approaching the line where Young Hawk was stationed, the animal wounded in either the neck or cheek. As the horse passed by, Young Hawk struck it, declaring, "I strike an enemy's horse." Meanwhile, the white soldiers were shouting and calling out. When Red Bear arrived at Forked Horn and dismounted, Young Hawk approached him on horseback and said, "Uncle, I have struck the bay horse, and it is mine, but I give it to you. You have a rope. Take the horse for yourself." Red Bear responded, "What's the use? We are in the middle of a fight, and I might be killed, so it will be of no use to me." Young Hawk then returned to his position. At that moment he noticed Little Brave riding out from the timber and heard him say that, from the yelling in the Dakota camp, he understood a little of their language. It seemed they were preparing to charge. Little Brave suggested, "Let me fire one shot at the camp, and then we should retreat to the hill. They are too many for us." As Little Brave dismounted to take his shot, Red Bear held his horse. After firing, Little Brave quickly returned and informed Red Bear that the Dakotas were indeed preparing to charge, and advised that they should mount and ride back toward the timber, then cross the river. They began their retreat, but as they moved through the bushes toward the river, they were met by a volley of gunfire from the opposite side of the Little Bighorn, where Dakotas were lying in ambush without horses. This forced the scouts to retreat again to their original position. When they attempted to move toward the river again, they saw a large group of Dakota horsemen riding between the ridge and the river, heading toward the ford with loud yells and gunfire. The area was swarming with them. Red Bear dismounted as the Dakotas fired and led his horse, but a leaning tree struck the saddle horn and halted the horse. He struggled repeatedly to pull the horse forward until it finally moved, though the saddle girth broke in the process, causing him to lose his extra cartridges. Despite this, he pressed on, not turning back. Twice, as he tried to mount the horse, the canteen hanging around his neck got in the way, causing him to fall off. Eventually, he succeeded in mounting and continued after Little Brave, who had remained mounted and was far ahead by this time. Emerging from the timber, Red Bear lost sight of Little Brave due to the thick smoke and dust filling the air. However, he vaguely made out a figure riding ahead. At that moment he spotted 10 soldiers on horseback in full retreat toward the timber. At this moment there was a deep ravine, and the soldiers' horses fell into it. He heard their cries of, "Whoa, whoa!" He swiftly turned his horse to the left, avoiding the ravine, leaving the soldiers struggling with their horses. He pursued Little Brave until a dark shape ahead veered left. Believing this could not be Little Brave, he continued riding straight past the spot where the rider had turned. His horse stumbled and fell, throwing him off. The horse then bolted toward the river, and Red Bear chased after it. This area was open, with a few trees and many rose bushes. A long, dry branch snagged the side of the bridle, dragging behind the horse and halting it, allowing Red Bear to catch up. The rope hanging from the bridle gave him a grip, but the horse was frightened and bucked violently. Because he could only use his left hand, he struggled to control the horse, still holding his gun in his right hand. Then he spotted a Dakota rider approaching from upstream on his right. The man's face was painted, red on the lower half and yellow on the upper half, including his forehead and eyes. Red Bear shot the Dakota, causing him to fall from his horse, which reared and spun around. At this point, all Red Bear could hear was the continuous sound of gunfire and the sharp whistles of the Dakotas. He followed his horse to the river where it was swimming. He jumped into the water, swam toward the horse, seized its mane, and they crossed together. As he climbed out, he noticed the horse of the Dakota he had shot swimming behind him. The horse was a dark bay, with a white streak on its forehead, and a string of deer hooves hanging around its neck, clattering as it swam. This horse passed slightly above him, and downstream Red Bear saw Little Brave, who had already crossed the river. Little Brave was wounded beneath his right shoulder, with blood flowing down over his white shirt. Little Brave's horse was trotting slowly toward the ridge, but not upstream toward Red Bear. Red Bear approached where the Dakota horse had landed, intending to drive it toward Little Brave. Just then, Bobtailed Bull's horse appeared, coming up the bank through the bushes on his left. The reins and rope were flying, and the tail and mane billowed in the wind. The horse, frightened, ran past Red Bear, only a few yards away, and he noticed the saddle was soaked in blood at the front. 5 or 6 white soldiers were riding through the bushes on his left, having just crossed the river. The horse of Bobtailed Bull trailed behind, and the Dakota horse he was leading raced after the others. Bobtailed Bull's saddle was a traditional Indian saddle with a wooden frame, covered in rawhide. Bloody Knife was the only one with a government-issued saddle, horse, and equipment. Little Brave was still riding slowly, waving to Red Bear to signal him to slow down as well. The Dakotas were positioned above them on the hills, shooting down at them. Red Bear mistakenly thought Little Brave's wave meant he should catch one of the horses for him, as Little Brave's horse was exhausted. So Red Bear dismounted and grabbed at a rope that was trailing through the bushes, attached to either a Dakota horse or Bobtailed Bull's. But the horse was terrified, and although Red Bear held onto the rope, he was dragged through the bushes, losing his moccasins in the river, his bare feet torn by rose bushes. The horse pulled him upstream toward the ridge's end, while Little Brave and the soldiers rode straight into the Dakota's firing line. Eventually, Red Bear let go of the rope and mounted his own horse. He didn't see Little Brave again and assumed all the soldiers had been killed. As he reached the ridge's end, he saw many soldiers retreating. At the front of the group was Reno, with a white handkerchief tied around his head, his mouth and beard covered in foam, which dripped down, and his eyes wide and frantic. The soldiers with Reno mistook Red Bear for a Dakota and aimed their guns at him, but he rode up close to Reno and struck him on the chest with an open hand, shouting, "Scout! Scout!" Reno responded, calling out, "The Sioux! The Sioux!" "Where?" Red Bear pointed down over the ridge where the Dakotas were. At that moment, an officer with 3 stripes handed him some cartridges for his gun. The officer had boxes of cartridges on his arm, and as he opened one, the cartridges spilled out. While giving Red Bear the cartridges, the officer called to him, "John, John." The group then fired at the Dakotas higher on the ridge, aiming only by holding their guns up at an angle and firing. Red Bear felt a bullet graze his coat at his armpit. A Dakota horse, wounded in the hindquarters, ran toward them, and Red Bear tried to capture it. He stood up to do so, for they were all crouching and shooting, but the soldiers shot the horse. At this point, Reno made a brief pause, but he couldn't keep his men together as they continued to retreat, although a number of them stayed behind. Then the Dakotas began to retreat and ceased firing. The remaining mounted scouts soon arrived and joined Reno's men. 7 scouts were unaccounted for: Young Hawk, Bloody Knife, Bob-tailed Bull, Little Brave, Forked Horn, Red Foolish Bear, and Goose. Red Bear had remounted when he couldn't catch his horse on the flat, and the last he saw of Little Brave was his horse and rider moving at a slow trot. Red Bear rode to the top of the ridge and saw Dakota scout White Cloud approaching from the river. White Cloud informed Red Bear that the Arikara scouts had driven off several Dakota horses and were expected to return, but had not yet done so. White Cloud then suggested to Red Bear, "Let's go to where the scouts with the horses are." White Cloud had 1 horse he was leading, and Red Bear had 2 horses he picked up at Reno's halt, which he was guiding. They reached a small hill and saw 4 riders coming toward them. Thinking they were Dakotas, they turned to head back toward Reno. However, the riders were actually Crow scouts, who appeared to recognize Red Bear and waved to him as a signal of friendship. He stopped and called the Dakota scout back, now recognizing the Crow Indian attire with red painted shoulders on a white shirt. The Crow scouts halted and then rode together. The Crow scouts mentioned that 2 of their men had been killed on the ridge and that they would go there before returning. The missing Crow scouts were those who had fled with Young Hawk. The Crow scouts then continued toward the ridge, while Red Bear and White Cloud waited for them for a long time. Eventually, Red Bear told White Cloud, "The Crow scouts will not come back. Let's return to Reno." They went back and found Reno still with his soldiers at the same spot. Just then, the scouts who had obtained fresh horses returned. The first to arrive was Bull in the Water, followed by Strikes 2, Red Star, Boy Chief, One Feather, Soldier, Stabbed, Strikes the Lodge, and Little Sioux. After a while, the other scouts arrived with a herd of captured horses, about 40 in total. The scouts were Charging Bull, Bull, Red Wolf, and White Eagle. Where Reno's men were, the soldiers occupied the higher ground, while the scouts were positioned down the slope, roughly 10 rods away. Stabbed was riding about on horseback, giving a speech. He said, "What are we doing now, we scouts? We should follow Custer's orders if we are defeated. He told us to retreat to the Powder River, where the rest of the scouts' wagons and supplies are." Pretty Face had already joined them from the pack mule train and was present at the time. Red Bear did not see this mule train at all. Pretty Face was likely with the herd scouts on their return journey. The white soldiers were partly dismounted in their group, but Red Bear did not notice any officers. The scouts were talking among themselves about the 7 who had been killed. Red Bear, for his part, was relieved to be among them again. Stab told them that part of the scouts were to take the herd of horses forward, while the rest would stay behind to hold off the Dakotas. So some of the scouts prepared to move with the horses. They were Bull in the Water, Charging Bull, Red Wolf, White Eagle, Red Star, Pretty Face, Red Bear, One Feather, and the Dakota Scout, Pta-Ate, and they set off with the herd of horses. Those who stayed behind were Strikes 2, Stabbed, Soldier, Boy Chief, Strikes the Lodge, Little Sioux, the 2 Dakota Scouts, White Cloud, and Karu, the half-breed Dakota interpreter, Esk, and Bull. The 10 scouts with the herd of horses hadn't gone far when another Dakota scout, Bear Waiting, Matoksha, joined the group assigned to keep the Dakotas at bay. Red Bear and his scouts rode past the lone teepee, and by the time they were 6 miles away from it, the sun was beginning to set behind the hills. They followed the same trail they had used earlier that morning. Not long after, Bull joined them, sent by Strikes 2 with instructions to pick up the pace, as he could see Dakota tents moving, and they feared the Dakotas might attempt to chase the herd. From there, Bull continued with them, and after sundown, Red Wolf and Bull in the Water rode ahead of the herd. As it grew darker, they heard 3 shots fired from ahead of the herd. The scouts behind took notice, circled around the herd, and rode ahead, reaching the valley of the Rosebud when it was too dark to see. The 2 scouts who had been ahead turned back when they heard the gunshots, and upon reaching the herd, they agreed that the Dakotas were coming toward them and that they should flee. They then selected fresh horses and rode ahead. When the scouts who were driving the herd from behind heard the shots, they turned back to check the trail and saw a cloud of dust rising, dirt flying as if from the hooves of many horses, and they assumed it was the Dakotas chasing them. They too took fresh horses from the herd and rode on until they reached the black line of timber. Here they paused, hungry and thirsty, as a strong wind blew. They waited at the edge of the timber while one of the scouts rode ahead, crossing a cut bank, and discovered a muddy waterhole. He called the others, and they led their horses over the bank, which caused them to slide down. Each scout then dug a drinking hole with his hands, drinking from the water as it filled the hole. However, there was not enough water for the horses. As they discussed their situation, Whole Buffalo claimed to know the way out, so they followed him to the Rosebud, arriving at midnight, and then proceeded to the Cheyenne Agency by dawn. After climbing a high ridge, they stopped and looked down at the site of the Dakotas' Sundance. The Dakota scout advised them to stay there until sundown so they could see in all directions, both behind and ahead. They stayed until evening, some sleeping while others kept watch. Then they rode through the night, reaching the camp where Bloody Knife had been intoxicated by morning. Searching through the camp remnants, they found meat and spoiled crackers, which they ate for breakfast. They crossed the Rosebud at the same point they had crossed earlier. There they discovered that Stabbed scouts had already crossed ahead in a rush, recognized by the tracks of Stabbed's mule. They then followed the Rosebud to its mouth and arrived at the old camp, the last parade ground. There they found signs of a fresh campfire, including cooking cans. They concluded that it had been the breakfast camp of the group ahead, now around noon. They traveled down the Rosebud's bank and found some spoiled, wet crackers, which they packed into saddlebags before continuing. The party led by Strikes 2 saw them and mistook them for Dakotas, speeding off out of sight. They followed the old Custer trail slowly until they neared the Tongue River, then camped in the timber atop a ridge. The next morning, they crossed the Tongue River and reached the spot where a soldier had been clubbed to death. They continued up a range to the Powder River camp, where they found Strikes 2's party and a company of infantry with a wagon train. The commander, wearer of the white hat from Fort Buford, had 2 interpreters, the Santee, a half-breed Dakota, and Crow Bear, a Grove hunter. They relayed all the details of the fight to the officer. The officer gathered the scouts, instructing them to bring in their horses. He selected 2 of the best horses for the scouts to carry a message to the officer who had traveled up the Elk River on a steamboat to the mouth of the Bighorn River. Foolish Bear and White Cloud were chosen for the task. These 2 scouts swam their horses across the Yellowstone, or Elk River, taking their guns and a small bag, with the message on a raft they towed behind them. After several days, they reached the mouth of the Bighorn, where they called for Strikes 2 and Bull in the Water to cross and carry the mail to Fort Buford. Foolish Bear and White Cloud then recrossed the river to join the other scouts. As the dust settled and the chaos of battle faded, Red Bear's mind raced with the memories of the day's brutal events. The retreat, the gunfire, and the wounded soldiers haunted him. With his comrades scattered and the echoes of battle still ringing in the air, Red Bear had only one thought: survival. Despite the losses and the harrowing challenges, the scouts, including himself, had made it through. But as they looked back over the ridge, the price of their bravery was clear. Some would never return. The legendary Battle of Custer's Last Stand was over for now, but for Red Bear and the surviving scouts, the war was far from finished.